some very quick housekeeping for us while we're waiting for the participants to join. If you find that your if you find that your bandwidth is having problems or your voice sounds funny, it helped in a previous panel to just turn off your own video. So that can like free up a little bit of bandwidth. And then we'll also, you know, when one person is speaking, if the rest of us can just stay on mute, that can also help just with a smooth streaming experience here. So we'll wait just one more minute.
Aisha, the first panel was very good.
Oh, I'm glad you, yeah.
Yeah,
so
I sat through all of them just to get a sense of how they were being run and what the moderators were expecting from the panels. Is very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's really just, you know, to sort of collect thoughts about where we are and, you know, what we should be thinking about in the next weeks and months. In this one, you know, particularly around health and climate. Okay, so I guess we can start, and I will pull up my notes. Let's just see. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today on this on these series of webinars under the Civic Space program. It's part of an exciting series of panels today, and I think so many of them are just the beginnings of conversations. So hopefully we'll have more opportunities to have these webinars. I want to thank Adrian Jefferson and Daniel Fitzmaurice for holding our hands and curating and helping put together this whole program today. So I'll start with brief introductions of all the panelists and then set the stage briefly for our conversation. What our audience members can at any time put questions into the chat box, but I think because we have limited time, we'll just save them for the end and address those at the end. So we'll do brief introductions. Feel free, if I've left anything out when it's your turn to speak, feel free to add to your introduction and your background. So I'll start with Laura. Dr. Laura Abbasi is the Director of Programs for the Yale Center for Health and Climate. Sorry, just lost. The Yale Center on Climate Change and Health, where she plays a key role in broadening its online education offerings, communications, and community-based engagement, and developing new programs, including an environmental health and climate health justice clinic, and a report on climate change and health. Alicia Santilli is a principal investigator for the CDC program, Racial and Ethnic Approaches to Community Health, REACH, and also the director of the Community Alliance for Research Engagement, known as CARE, at the Southern Connecticut State University. And she has been collaborating with the cities of New Haven's Department of Transportation on an active transportation plan. Karen Jenkins is a founding board member of the New Haven Coalition for Active Transportation. She also has over 3 decades of international executive management of NGOs and nonprofits, as well as academic leadership. And she's currently the managing principal of Development for Good. And she's also director emeritus of the board of directors of the League of American Bicyclists, and has served on numerous social venture and philanthropic boards. Asha Ghosh is program manager at the newly renamed School of the Environment, formerly known as the Forestry School. And she is coordinating the new urban studies concentration. She comes from a planning background and worked for the Asia Foundation, advising in the areas of decentralization, local governance, and civil society engagement. And she's also a yoga instructor. So I hope after we've all spent so much time staring at our screens, like she'll have some like excellent advice and she'll be very valuable coming out of this. So my name is Aisha Woods. I'm the Executive Director of New Haven City Plan. Prior to this, I worked as a design consultant for many years with a focus in Southeast Asia on larger urban regeneration projects. So many of our urban challenges require very open and intensive interdisciplinary collaboration. So I'm so delighted to be having this conversation with all of you and listening and learning from the different perspectives you bring to considering urban challenges around health and climate. I also want to thank city colleagues who have been part of this ongoing conversation, particularly from our transportation department, Doug Hausladen, and on city plan, Maya Vardy and Keith Lawrence. And there's many other city colleagues who have been part of this, as well as other partners who have been working with us in conceptualizing a grant program, a grant around this general topic. I wanted to just take a quote from Jane Jacobs, of course, who was requoted in the New York Times this weekend in a beautiful section on some of the issues facing our city. I encourage all the audience to spend some time on, that Sunday insert the opinion pieces about the role of cities right now and the role of urban open space. I don't want to take up too much time re-quoting, but I'll just quote from Jane Jacobs. Streets and their sidewalks, the main public spaces of a city, are its most vital organs. So public health and planning have always been very linked. I think some of those themes are being brought up again now as we come out of COVID. As we come into a new period of healing and recovery, we're mindful of underlying health inequities that are geographically, socially, and racially mapped across our city. In the overwhelming urge to go outside and even celebrate collectively, how can practitioners and policymakers listen carefully and develop new tools and strategies for collective and inclusive prioritization and decision-making? This climate and health equity panel was inspired by a series of conversations and collaborations across city health departments and focused on some topics raised in a grant application for Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I'm going to turn it over to, I don't want to spend too much time like focused just on the grants, but more taking out some of the themes that have come out of that. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura to kind of set the interconnectedness of the themes that we're addressing today through the describing the grant a bit.
Okay, great. Thanks, Aisha, and nice to be with you all. So the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation set out this really kind of complicated, very interesting request for proposals where they said that they wanted projects that were taking an idea from outside the US that was kind of a proven approach to addressing climate change, health, and equity together and bring it to an American city and apply it. And so they wanted something that was addressing climate change mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gases or adapting to the climate change that we're already experiencing, while also having health co-benefits, so immediate benefits for the health of residents, and with a strong focus on equity, on addressing the needs of communities most impacted and authentically incorporating them into the decision-making process. So we came up with an idea that I think is pretty neat, drawing on an organization in Cape Town, South Africa called Open Streets Cape Town. And so they use open streets like ciclovias, so closing down a road to allow for sort of like a community fair and bicyclists and walkers on that street, but that they also incorporated some other elements. So they have something called Talking Streets, where it's kind of like a walking meeting or a walking focus group. And they have something that we're adapting a bit, that's Street Lab, where it's kind of innovating creative solutions and bringing people together to look at those different solutions. So we're taking all of these community engagement pieces and applying them in New Haven. And so first of all, the organization Cape Town is just doing a really amazing job and addressing, they've shown how these approaches can work, especially in a city like Cape Town with such intense history of apartheid and racial segregation, and showing the power of bringing people together to walk on a street together, to visit a neighborhood that they haven't been to before. And they do a lot of community engagement in preparation for these activities. So we've learned a lot about what really strong community engagement can look like. But then we're taking, the idea that we have is to take it a step beyond, which is that we want to use it to inform not just transportation policy, kind of what could a street look like, but also what could other elements look like to address climate change going forward. And so we've also been through the city plan, looking at green ordinances, like ones to address urban heat, like green roofs or white roofs or other kinds of solutions, looking at stormwater for urban flooding, looking at urban agriculture. And so what could be an otherwise kind of wonky policy of an ordinance, we're proposing that we could use this very on the ground public engagement process to help people maybe even think about standing in the street and thinking, what would it be like if it were 5 degrees hotter on this hot day? What would I want to have as an amenity on my street to make it a safer place for me? Or what are the issues that are in my community now that are affecting my health that might also be solved through some of these climate solutions? And making sure that we're sort of bringing the sort of scaffolding along the way to be able to think about, climate change is not everyday conversation. Understanding future projections isn't an everyday kind of conversation. And so we're also looking at what's the kind of workshops that we can have. We're planning an online map that would include some projections so that we can sort of introduce these ideas, but really grounded in resident-driven priorities and perspectives. And it's also in line with a lot of the work that's around community climate resilience. So by building social capital, building connectedness across community members, then when something hits, whether it's a hurricane or a pandemic, any of these kinds of shocks to the system, having that kind of having the resources and trust and focal points within a community helps for recovery and afterwards. So that's what we are kind of imagining right now. We really hope to get the grant. I think, though, honestly, it's the kind of thing that I think has inspired a lot of ideas and connecting across different agencies that I think either way it's got some great potential. And maybe the last thing that I'll just say, it also, another requirement of the grant was that it had to have at least 2 agencies, at least 2 disciplines on the project team. And so we've spanned out beyond that with city plan and transportation, engineering, food policy, and a number at UConn and Yale as other partners. And I think the idea is that these kind of wicked problems require solutions that are looking at it from these many different perspectives.
Thank you, Laura. I think
Sure.
that's a great overview, and it's such a nice segue into the work that Alicia has been doing. Alicia has really been working in this space for a number of years, specifically in the connection between health and participatory engagement activities. So I just wanted to ask Alicia if she could talk a little bit about her work, both, the work, both broadly in the two programs that you're working in, but also specifically in your collaborations with the city, and how you could see this translating forward into, into impacting policies that the city might adopt at some point.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be on the panel with these great other panelists. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about CARE and our work, which is mostly health focused, but as many of you probably realize, there is a huge overlap between health and climate change, of course. Even within the context of chronic disease prevention, which is primarily our focus, there's quite a lot of overlap between issues related to chronic disease prevention and climate change. So I work at an organization called CARE, the Community Alliance for Research and Engagement. We've been around since 2007 and actually started at the Yale School of Public Health. And a few years ago, started a partnership with Southern Connecticut State University. So we have affiliations with both universities, and I sit at SCSU. And our mission, quite broadly, is to improve health in New Haven. It goes on a little bit from there, but that's the shorthand of it. And within that context, we have been focused primarily on chronic disease prevention. And here in New Haven, when we started out doing some of this work, we were told quite clearly by a number of our community collaborators, both within City Hall and other community partners and neighborhood groups, that if we were going to start working on any issues related to health, we should primarily focus our efforts on what's historically been defined as the 6 low-income neighborhoods in New Haven. So in those 6 neighborhoods, which are also predominantly communities of color, we've really tried to focus a lot of our efforts in that area. And this is where a lot of health disparities exist in our city. So I'll just take a really quick example of food insecurity. If you look across the city as a whole, our food insecurity rate is at about 20%, which is pretty high. The statewide average is about 12%. But most of that is driven by food insecurity in our 6 low-income neighborhoods, where it is closer to 33%. We really see our health disparities playing out in terms of people's access to food. So that's just a quick example. And of course, there's so many connections between food and climate change and health. But in terms of chronic disease prevention, access to healthy food, being able to have a healthy diet, and exercise are 2 of the major risk factors. So if we can make some changes related to how people are getting exercise and where people are getting access to healthy foods, we could really make much more of a difference around chronic disease, particularly in our low-income communities. So interestingly, over the past, I would say, decade or so, maybe a little bit longer, there has been quite a shift in the public health focus when we think about chronic disease prevention. When I first started this work, there was a lot of focus on individual behavior change. And right around then, I would say the tide was starting to change within the public health field as a whole. And really starting to recognize that it's not just about individual behavior change. So a doctor can tell a patient to eat more healthy and go exercise, but if they don't live in a safe community, or if they don't have access to healthy foods in their community that are affordable, it's pretty impossible to think about how to engage in healthier behaviors. So the shift really started to focus more on changes that we can make at the community level and within systems and within infrastructure. So this is where the built environment comes in for us. the built environment and how our communities are set up to encourage people to engage in healthy or unhealthy behaviors. You know, getting people to walk and bike more in their communities is a way that we can really focus on chronic disease prevention. But we really have to take a serious look at our built environment and how again, it is allowing people to be able to exercise or not. Lots of folks don't have access to safe streets, safe sidewalks. It's really difficult to get to parks in some neighborhoods. The parks, folks might not feel very safe in their city parks. So we have been working on issues related to the built environment and specifically active transit for a while, trying to figure out how we can build better systems of infrastructure around this. So we've worked on a couple of projects over the years, including a marked walking trail in Fairhaven that we worked really closely with Doug at the Transportation Department and some neighborhood groups in Fairhaven to build, and that's been really successful. So fast forward to today, or to actually almost 2 years ago, there is a grant that we applied for through the Center for Disease Control that Aisha mentioned. It's called REACH, Racial and Ethnic Approaches to Community Health. And we applied and we're very fortunate to get that funding here for New Haven. And there's 3 major strategies. They're focused on community clinical linkages, nutrition, and then physical activity. And interestingly, so this is coming from the CDC, and interestingly, the entire strategy on the entire strategy for physical activity was solely focused on developing active transit options and really encouraging communities to develop active transit master plans. So it's been an incredible opportunity to collaborate more closely with the city and with communities here in New Haven to figure out, you know, what this is and what this means. So active transit is any type of transportation that is self-propelled or human-powered mode of transportation. So walking and biking, and taking the bus is often, you know, put into that category as well because you have to walk to get to the bus. So an active transit master plan is a plan that the city puts together for every single road and street and sidewalks in New Haven to figure out, as new projects are being developed in the city or paving is being done, there will be a plan in place for every single street to make it more walking and biking friendly. So we're in the very beginning stages of working on that. It's been really exciting to be able to partner with the city. I think we do a lot of really fantastic things at the city level, focus on bike and pedestrian safety and infrastructure. And this is really a way to try and bring it all together. So one thing to point out is that the built environment is very much a health equity issue and a racial equity issue. When we look at our communities that have safer pedestrian and biking infrastructure, they tend to not always be our communities of color or low-income neighborhoods here in New Haven. So our focus at CARE has been to really ensure that communities that might not normally be involved in processes like these or be asked to be at the table are included and that their voices are heard as the active transit master plan is being rolled out. So we're really trying to bring in that health equity perspective around an active transit plan, which is challenging because it's a super, you know, policy wonky idea. And it's a challenging thing to engage regular residents around, but we're really hoping that people will see the importance of, you know, focusing in on active transit. You know, one way to really think about this is as we think about urban renewal, and in mid-century, the traffic was designed to get people in and out of the city very quickly. There was a lot of white flight at the time, and it was about ensuring that white workers from the suburbs could come in and leave quickly. And it didn't really give a lot of consideration to the people who live here. So we're trying to put a more of a lens and focus on that. So we are just in the very beginning stages of pulling together this active transit master plan. We're working with a national consultant. Right before COVID-19, we were about to we were about to start a series of community forums to start getting resident input. And unfortunately, we were not able to move forward with those. So we're doing some outreach via the CMT Zoom calls right now, and hoping that we can engage some folks that way. And we're kind of rethinking how we can do the community engagement component when we're all, engaging virtually right now. So I'm not sure I addressed everything that Aisha wanted me to, but I feel like I've been talking long enough, so I'll pause here and turn it back over to Aisha, and maybe there's some questions I can answer during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Alicia. That's really, that I feel like the work that you're doing is so connected and related to what we've been trying to articulate in our grant application conversations. So thanks for sharing that. It's also a great lead in for Karen Jenkins, who has lots of experience with these just amazing community engagement projects around active transportation, and both involving biking and walking. And I will just hand it over to Karen, because you have so many great stories about these types of events. So
thank you, Aisha. Aisha, you didn't mention that I'm a member of the Historic District Commission in New Haven, and I will come back to that a bit later. For those of you who wonder about the importance of advocacy for safe streets, if you had asked me 20 years ago if I would become a national advocate for safe streets, open streets, even streets at all, I would have said you were crazy. It was a worst nightmare. However, through my affiliation with first the New Jersey Bike and Walk Coalition, and then as chair of the board of the League of American Bicyclists, I became very much involved in advocacy. And I always start by I usually ask it as a question, but I'll tell you that the streets in any municipality take up 80 to 90% of the public space. So our streets are really our biggest public space, and yet they're only used for one reason. I also want to mention that the League of American Bicyclists, which I had the very great pleasure of chairing that board of directors, was founded in 1880 by cyclists who were advocating for a road network for bicycles. So our roads were not designed originally for cars, they were designed for bicycles. And there's a really good book by a man named Carlton Reed. I think it's entitled "The Roads Were Not Built for Cars." His name is Carlton Reed. And there's a whole history of how the auto industry took over. But our first advocacy in 1880 started for bicycles. So that's important to keep in mind. I've had the very great fortune when I lived in New Brunswick, New Jersey, of being on the first planning committee for the Ciclavia in New Brunswick. And we actually went to Robert Wood Johnson for funding. So I'm very familiar with that particular funding process. We also made a very wise move of inviting Gil Peñalosa to our Ciclavia. And Gil Peñalosa founded 880 Cities, which many of you may not know, is one of the premier organizations in the world that promotes open streets events or ciclavias. Now, throughout my brief presentation, I'm going to use the word ciclavia, partly out of respect to our Spanish speakers who understand what a ciclavia is. And as we discovered in New Brunswick, when we were arguing about what to name the event, well, half the city knew what the word ciclavia meant, so that solved that problem. So I tend to use the word ciclavia, but it really is an open streets event. And in its essence, an open streets event or ciclavia closes miles of roads. Unlike South Africa, where I visited that open street event, or what they're called talking streets, it is not a street festival where you close 1 or 2 blocks. The concept is to close miles of streets, open miles of streets to non-motorized traffic, for people to use that public space freely by walking, in their wheelchairs, jogging, whatever form of non-motorized transportation. And then there's events on the route that get people to become active. Part of the reason you hold a ciclavia is that you want people to be physically active. And that's what the ciclavia helps to promote. You want to have sports events. You want to promote culture. So if the route goes past a museum, the museum might have chalk painting for children on the streets, or open admission to the museum for people to come in. You want to involve your schools and your higher education institutions. You need to have recreation and play activities all along the route. Also to involve the businesses. And the other thing, and I pointed this out in several communications, that while biking is particularly important to me, frankly, we are all pedestrians. And at a ciclovia, you want to make sure that the non-bikers are actually walking, that they feel comfortable. So even in your public campaigns, in your graphics, you always want to promote walking, showing elderly people with canes on pushers, women or men pushing baby strollers, because otherwise your cyclists will take over and they'll tend to think that the route is a race. It is not a race. The ciclovia can affect all parts of the community: recreation and sports, health, education, schools, higher education. Certainly has an impact on the environment. Right now, the air is clearer because there are fewer roads and fewer cars in New Haven. There's less air transportation. I can hear the birds. So we all understand how important it is to minimize the number of cars on the road. The parking authority is a partner in a ciclovia. Police and fire departments who come out, it's especially important to run your route if you can, past fire departments, police departments, or police offices, so they can open their doors, step out, participate with young people. Obviously, the fire department has to keep the door open in case there's an emergency, but the fire workers step out, hand out bike helmets, help elderly with walking. It really is a very active community transportation project that can and should involve all sectors of the community. The private sector should be involved, local businesses, the Chamber of Commerce, grocery stores, large and small, restaurants, retail businesses, and then the people who step outside their house, and this poses maybe some licensing issues, but people will step outside and sell their barbecue on the lawn in front of the route. So it really becomes a time for the private sector to be involved, civil society, especially houses of worship, because generally ciclovias are run on Sundays. Well, you want the route to go past churches that may hold their service outside those days if the ciclovia is on, or invite people to come inside, stop on the route, come inside for the service. The houses of worship become especially important in communicating what's happening. Social media is only one tool. What's really important is that there's face-to-face communication, telephone communication, to let people know what a ciclovia is, that all are welcome, everyone should come. It involves volunteers, your foundations and philanthropic organizations, community centers, all kinds of organizations. And they also address problems that we're looking at, from obesity, physical inactivity, which affects so many people in our communities, the feeling among citizens that the streets are unsafe. There's a decreased quality of life because of too much traffic, lack of space for social interaction, air pollution, and the community that are segregated. As much as I love living in New Haven, this is a segregated city, as are most cities in this country. Well, the ciclovia, a street event only closes, or block party only closes 1 or 2 blocks. A ciclovia, as I said, is miles of a route, and that encourages people to go from one part of a neighborhood to another, walking, biking, having pedicabs for the elderly, that you really want to push people from one neighborhood to another that they might not have visited before. The ciclovia offers solutions and have demonstrated that participants after a ciclovia have a higher rate of activity. There's an increase in biking and walking, greater use of public transportation. People feel differently about their streets, feel like they're safer. Of course, pollution and air noise is reduced. And interestingly, crime along the route is also reduced because everybody's in the streets. So are the criminals, so nobody can rob anybody. Everybody's watching. It also promotes social interaction and inclusion and equity because people come from all socioeconomic areas and include people with disabilities, older adults, children, families, and minorities, and also can provide opportunities for economic revitalization. So I should say that I've been to the ciclovia in Guadalajara, Mexico, the ciclovia in Los Angeles, and also New York Summer Streets, which runs 3 weeks in August, and it runs from, I think, about 79th Street all the way down to about 14th Street. So that's it, the ciclovias, and I can at some point talk about how to get started with the ciclovia, but I'm very familiar with that funding. Actually, I should also mention that, if I didn't earlier, If you go to the eight cities website, where there is a wealth of information about ciclavias, just unlimited free information, was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So thank you.
Karen, thank you so much. Your enthusiasm it's so inspiring, and I think you really you help us imagine how this might actually work in New Haven. Like you conjure up images that I can imagine on our streets in New Haven. So thank you for that very vivid picture. So I wanted to turn to Asha now. You have experience in planning and advising local governments around the world. So I'd be really interested to hear a little bit about, the urban concentration, but also just your thoughts on, this kind of international cross-pollination of models, like looking to cities, not just in Connecticut, but around the world for models that could be translated. And also about this kind of this hyper-local, infusion of knowledge into policy and how that translation happens. Like, how do you go from a walk, in a neighborhood and really understanding how people experience space, public space, to to translating that into policy. So that's sort of a kind of multi-pronged question that I'm throwing your way, but go ahead.
Thanks so much, Aisha, and thanks so much for inviting me. It's always such a great opportunity for me to learn about so many of the different things that are happening, and particularly in New Haven. I've been in Connecticut only for about 1.5 years now, so I'm still in the process of kind of seeing what's happening, and it's always inspiring to me, both the people I meet and the activities that are underway. I'll start with a little bit about the urban specialization at FES. We are still the School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences until July 1st. And we just launched the urban specialization this semester. So that was really exciting for us. And as you all probably well know and can imagine, we have faculty across Yale working on issues of urbanization and around cities. And in particularly, if we look right now at what's happening in terms of post-COVID, or looking at, kind of looking forward at urban resilience, we have, we've got Karen Sito looking at urbanization and climate change and also networks of cities. We've got Jeffrey Alexander in sociology looking at collective senses of instability and anxiety. We've got David Vlahov in nursing looking at COVID and informal areas. I mean, I can go on because the list is quite long and would probably cover every discipline. So what I want to say about that is, when we're looking at the urban specialization within FES, while the students within the FES program are really focused on getting a science-based education looking at the environment, we're also using the urban specialization as an opportunity to connect across Yale, to look at cities from multiple perspectives. So we're encouraging students to take classes not only at FES, but also across the disciplines at Yale. Because ultimately, when you come out and you're working on cities, and you're working within a city government, as you well know, you need to be able to talk across all these disciplines. You need to be able to talk with the Economic Development Office. You need to be able to talk with the Transportation Department, and you need to be able to connect all of these things together. So we really want students to come out with a sense of being able to articulate themselves across disciplines, and a sense that they can work together in the multidisciplinary way that cities require, and that looking at the challenges of urbanization really requires. And related to that, I would say one of the things that I'm kind of most interested in is kind of, who is the future urban planner? And I'll jump to, kind of the third part of your question, which was on the local input. I've worked a lot across Asia looking at public participation in governance, and I've tried to look at different models of what's worked. And I do think that it's always useful to draw on models from different places just to feed our ideas. But at the same time, ultimately, everything is very local. The politics are very local, and what works in one place won't necessarily work the same way in another place if you don't really take into account the intricacies of the local politics. And I think that what I've seen happen many times is this idea of replicating, of taking an idea and saying, well, that worked really well there. How can we replicate that here? And it not working the same way. And people really wondering what's happened. Why is this not working in the same way? And it's really about being able to understand why the politics are different, or why the institutions are different, and how do you adapt what you like about the idea to the local context. And in that sense, I also have this question about who is the future urban planner. And I think when we tend to think about urban planning, we're thinking about space, we're thinking about urban design, but urban planning is, of course, much beyond that. It's really looking at overall well-being, as this panel is looking at well-being in urban areas. And so that means working both across a number of disciplines, but also across a number of scales. So when I think about the most effective versions of really looking at local input that I've seen, it requires not so much particular processes, but particular people who can be within an urban setting and be able to talk across multiple sectors, talk to people from very different perspectives, and be able to stand back and analytically look at how do I take all of that and put it together to make some coherence out of it. And not only look at it in terms of what's happening in this particular city, but how does this really connect this community to the city, to the state, and to the national framework. Because if we're looking at health equity, of course, we're looking at issues of national health policy, as well as we're looking at space and access to green spaces and the other things that are very important locally. But there are levers at the national level that also need to be paid particular attention to. So when we think about working in this kind of a setting and taking local information, I think it's really about having the kind of person who can draw this information like an ethnographer in a sense, and really be able to connect what they're finding both to what can be changed within the politics of the situation within which they reside, but also connect it to national policy and really create a platform for national advocacy and change. And in working with the public, I think the other really critical part of it is that taking the time from residents to ask them to answer questions, to give input, to provide their ideas, that's really that's an ask from them, and it doesn't make sense unless we're going to be able to show that there's going to be a return on that. So linking whatever the input is from what we're kind of collecting in a sense in terms of information needs to be linked to a budget. And at the end of the day, if there isn't participation in understanding the budget, so involving the community and really understanding what is the budget process, and where are the levers that they can really affect in terms of being able to move towards the things they want to see happen in their communities. Without that linkage, we're really working in one direction, and we don't want to have a participatory process which is working only in the direction of gathering information. We want to really incorporate everybody in the public decision-making process. So I would say that what I have seen fall short, I've looked at a lot of public participation on governance and services in cities, and what falls short is that the focus becomes on the process. Let's set up an advisory board, let's set up this set of town hall meetings, and it becomes about that process. And it gets separated from the idea that this is really about the entire engagement. It's not about this particular process or system or structure we set in place, but it's about the entire engagement and having people in place who can help be the facilitators of that engagement, which requires different things at different times. So I think those are some of the thoughts I had in mind based on what we're doing at Yale. And we're hoping that in our training through the urban specialization, we're also helping students to be able to graduate and be in a position to move into working in cities where they can really work across disciplines, across scales, and look at planning from a different lens in a sense. I don't know if I answered all your questions.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much. And you really, I think, you know, in New Haven, sometimes we do have a very local focus. And it helps to always be reminded it needs to be also connected at these, you know, these other levels of decision-making and funding areas, such as the state and the federal. You know, as we go planning these walks and, you know, building on, actually really, I should say, building on some of the great work that has already been done by many people in New Haven, by Alicia and her team, by Karen. You know, I think in a way what we're trying to do is take some of these activities, participatory activities that many people have already started and really enjoyed, and just helping support that and seeing if there's a way, you know, if that might be an avenue for people to have a greater say in some of the planning decisions we make. So I want to, since we're close to time, I think we have to hop off a few minutes before the hour to make space for the next panel. But I wanted to just get to some of the questions that are coming up in the chat. So the first question comes from Kevin McCarthy, and he asks, what additional steps can New Haven take to promote active transportation? And so this is where I would, if we were in a live audience, I would call on Doug to jump in on our panel and help out with this one. It's really, but I think just that the more awareness and, sorry about that, the more awareness and you know, advocacy also from residents saying that they're, you know, that this is important to them will help the city prioritize their focus on active transportation.
Actually,
I think,
I'm happy to answer that question.
okay, go ahead, Karen. Thank you so much.
Sure. So I'm one of the co-founders. Several of us founded a group called the New Haven Coalition for Active Transportation. We were founded after the mayor's task force for bike education did its work, and I had the very great privilege, thanks to Doug, to chair that committee. And out of it, we decided that we wanted to be more than bike education, that we wanted to promote active transportation. But one of our first goals is to provide bike education classes for everyone for free. In other words, bike education that is accessible to all people of all abilities. And our long-term goal is to have bike education in all the schools, public and private. That's really ambitious. But in order to have more active transportation, you have to promote it with people. You can't be passive about it. There has to be a vigorous ways, plural, that you're pushing people out to become active. The Ciclovia is one way to do it. I'm sure Alicia can speak to other ways, but that you can't just leave it to chance that people are going to use the parks, that they're going to walk to the grocery store or walk to their doctor's apartment. So that the issue of active transportation is one. And there are a lot of social justice issues around active transportation. Why was a street closed in East Rock and not over in New Hallville, or am I bringing up something contentious, or not off of Whaley Avenue? And we need to make sure that we are bringing bike infrastructure, walking infrastructure, safe infrastructure throughout all of the city and not just some neighborhoods. We also need to make sure that people, particularly with bikes, have decent bicycles to ride. Cheap bicycles are cheap. They break easily, they're not repaired easily. And also we have to recognize that there are a lot of people who are poor who ride their bicycles, especially men, to get to their work. And so we need to be mindful that they take the brunt of the crashes because they're riding at night, they're riding at dusk and dawn without helmets, without proper training. So I think that we need to have a structured way to provide information, classes, and activities for people that are structured around active transportation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Karen, so much. I mean, that just, you know, also reminds us that, and this was a point you had brought up in earlier conversations about how we shouldn't think of active transportation sort of as an extra kind of leisure activity. It's the way people get to work. It's very, it should be part of our, just the way we move around in the city. So when we're thinking about bike trails and alternative, improving our sidewalks and whatnot. So Alicia, did you want to add anything onto how can we promote?
Sure. The Active Transit Master Plan is actually a great example of policy that can be first advocated for. So as Karen was pointing out, making sure that there are people involved in that process of even, providing input into the Active Transit Master Plan. But then once we have it, it's a tool within city government. It'll become a formal plan of the city of New Haven. And then it is a tool that we can use collectively to advocate for, making sure that the city is utilizing it and enacting the plans that were put forth in the document. So I think that's a really direct way to try and influence policy around active transportation.
Aisha, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, that's about the third time I've done that today. Okay, Alicia, please say a little bit about how you've organized resident engagement around REACH and what are some of your challenges, and that comes from Keith Lawrence.
Great, thanks Keith for asking that. That was one of the few points I wasn't able to squeeze in earlier. So as our name implies, the Community Alliance for Research and Engagement, community engagement is really at the core of all of our work. We've been really focused on community engagement since our inception. And so we have done a lot over the years to try and organize with various neighborhood groups and community members around a variety of different issues. The walking trail that I mentioned earlier was a resident-led initiative. We try to offer resources and support around resident identified initiatives. So that was something that a group of residents identified wanting to work on. It actually languished for a couple of years because there just wasn't quite the right alignment of resources to get it moving and interest. CARE could have very easily stepped in and just gotten that project done, but we felt really, really strongly that as much as possible, activities should be led by residents. So that's just an example of some of the work we've done over the years. And so we've taken this model where we've been trying to organize with communities, and with our REACH grant, we actually incorporated a more formal program. So we kind of took our body of work over the previous couple of years and put a more formal framework on it. So we have two health leadership programs, New Haven Health Leaders, and then our Community Research Fellows program. And the Health Leaders program is funded by the REACH grant. And it's really about trying to engage residents at the grassroots level around health and health disparities that exist in New Haven, and figure out ways to get residents more engaged in all sorts of different activities that are taking place around New Haven. So we've only run one cohort of that particular program, and it went well. We do offer an option for residents to apply for like a mini grant through CARE and initiate a project in their neighborhood. And only a few people in our cohort picked up on that option and implemented projects, but that's really the idea behind it. So to get to the question of the challenges, resident engagement is challenging because folks have so much on their plates. So we have to be really careful about how we're engaging folks and then what kinds of activities, and making sure that we're providing the appropriate resources for folks to get involved. So we have 3 kind of tenets that we try and adhere to as a baseline, which is offering childcare, meals, and transportation. For most of our kind of programming that we do, we really try and have a stipend in place, trying to honor people's time with some money. I get paid to show up at tables, and other people should get paid as well. So those are a couple of ways that we try and encourage resident engagement, but it's really, really, really challenging. And there's a lot more that could be done, not just at CARE, but at, you know, many entities across the city.
Thank you, Alicia. Well, I think we are all, let's see. I think we're all set with the questions. So I just wanted to say thank you, all of you, for participating in this panel. It's been, you know, I've learned so much. I think Karen wanted to. Karen, did you want to?
Before you close, and I don't mean to step on your toes.
No, not at all. Please do. Please.
I'm going to say that it takes about 9 months for minimum 9 months for Cyclavia to happen. And so don't wait for a grant. Let's not do that. Let's get started. And I'll give you the 3 steps very quickly, all of you sitting out there. First of all, the New Haven Coalition for Active Transportation offered a session on Cyclavias in November. We sponsored one of the plenary speakers, Charles Brown, for the Multimodal Transportation Summit, and he generously offered a presentation on Cyclavias because he and I worked together on the one in New Haven. Don't wait, get started. And the 3 things you need to do is call together an inclusive planning committee that will create the mission and guidelines that will then inform all other activities. For instance, you're going to allow alcohol, you're going to discourage people from handing out pieces of paper. You want to reach as many people as possible on that planning committee, and I can another time give more information. The streets are free, they belong to all of us. So let's get together a committee that will really work inclusively to free up our streets. The planning, the engineers and the transportation people need to start working on a plan for the route. Where's the route going to be? Is it going to run through the 3 historic districts, run from 1 to 2 to 3? Could. It could run from park to park. It could run across houses of worship. There are many ways to decide how to do the route, but you certainly want to include those neighborhoods that have been ignored. So we don't need to go to East Rock. Let's go to my neighborhood, Fairhaven, or let's go over to New Homeville or Whaley or some of the other places. So they need to start planning the route. And you have to be really bold and pick a route and decide that the Cyclavia is going to happen every Sunday from March, April through September, October. It's not a 1-year event. So start really bold and say, we're going to do the route and do this thing 6, 8, 10 times a year, every Sunday, like they do in Bogota. So that's number 2. Number 3, and really important, is to make sure that a research and evaluation committee is built into the initial planning. And that involves a collaboration of your universities. You need to count everybody that's at the Cyclavia. So you've got students with counters. But the research and evaluation prove the point, the value of why the Cyclavia was important to getting people out onto the streets and inclusive community. So those are the 3 steps. Planning committee, get started on the route, and get started on your research and evaluation group. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate it. It is, I think, right, it's so important to also be, you know, as we're starting to think about opening up again and going back outside, which is, you know, has a lot of risks and there's a lot of anxiety associated with it. You know, being able to think ahead to some kind of celebratory use of public space, I think is really, I mean, I find it to be like a relief to think, you know, to think about something like that. And it's also, you know, we're being very cognizant of the health risks in terms of, you know, the pandemic, but I think also for our social cohesion, like being locked up or being inside for so long, it'll be really important for people to be able to see each other safely in our public space. That's going to start happening with, we'll have some outdoor dining. There'll be some outdoor retail as well. So we're going to start seeing activities in our public space in a different way. And maybe there's some long-term benefits for that. I can't, the idea of being able to have a restaurant in a park to me is very appealing. It's done in many places in the woods, around the world. But I'm just, looking forward to all this creative thinking about the use of public space. So with that, we're just about at time, but I'm sure this conversation will keep going, and this recording will be posted, and we're happy to, share links to various different things that were talked about today. So thank you everybody so much for your time and for listening in. And with that, we're perfectly on time. So see you. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Take care.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.